March, present day, and the wind comes down the open plains of Sheridan County, North Dakota, at 40 miles an hour, dragging the snow flat off every field it crosses. Every field but one. Along the middle of 80 acres of good wheat ground stands a long, dark line of pine and cedar, and on the sheltered side of that line, the snow lies even and deep, an unbroken white blanket a foot thick, while the open ground beyond it blows down to frozen dirt. A man in his 50s stands with his back to the camera in a canvas coat, an old ledger open in his gloved hand, watching the wind do exactly what he told them it would do. He says nothing. He has said nothing for 6 years. For 6 years, the whole county called it the dumbest thing a farmer ever did. Good wheatland, the kind you plow fence to fence for every last bushel, and he took rows of it out of production on purpose, to grow trees. Dale Hovland, who rents the quarter beside him, laughed at that fence line every spring. The bank had started circling after 2 thin years, and still the man planted pine where wheat should have been, and would not explain why. But to understand what he was really building out there, you have to go back to 1979, to a father, a ledger of snow depths, and a promise made in a cold barn. If you have ever been told your idea was worthless by people who never opened your notebook, this story is for you. Subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. 1979, a February morning in the Sheridan County barn, and Ellis Vange was 12 years old, holding a lantern while his father knelt over a dead calf. The wind had scoured the west field bare overnight and thrown a 6-foot drift across the calving pen, and 3 head had gone down in it before dawn. Marlin Vange did not curse. He carried the frozen calf out by the legs, set it in the sled, and came back in with snow crusted white on his beard. Then he pulled a black ledger from the shelf above the workbench and wrote the date, the depth, the loss in a small square hand. 40 years of that ledger sat on that shelf. Snow depths, killing drifts, calves lost in the open. Every hard winter since Marlin bought the place after the war. Ellis had watched his father write in it 100 times, without understanding why a man would keep score against the wind. "The wind takes the same road every year," Marlin said, not looking up. "Your grandfather learned it. I learned it. You will too." That night, the boy read the pages back by lantern light. The same fields blew bare and the same corners. The same lee sides buried the same stock. The wind had a map, and his father had spent 40 winters drawing it. Marlin died in 2009, in November, before the first snow. He left the 80 acres, the cattle, and the ledger. And he left one line, spoken in that cold barn, that Ellis would not understand for 30 years. April 2013. And Ellis Vange drove a tree spade down the middle of his best 80 acres while the ground was still cold enough to sting his hands. 4 years after his father went into the ground, 2 thin wheat years behind him, and here he was setting seedlings where the drill should have run. Rows of little pine and cedar, no taller than a coffee can, marching straight across cropland that had grown hard red spring wheat since Marlin bought the place. Dale Hovland pulled his truck up on the section line and let it idle. He rented the quarter to the west and farmed every foot of it, fence to fence. "You planting a Christmas lot, Ellis?" Dale called through the window, grinning. "Wheat's $4. Trees don't sell." Ellis straightened, set another seedling in the slit, and pressed the soil around it with his boot heel. He did not answer. Down at the Goodrich elevator that same week, the manager, a heavy-set man named Kurt Pelkey, told 2 farmers by the scale that Vange had planted about 1,000 trees across good ground and taken maybe 6 acres clean out of production on purpose. "His old man is spinning," Pelkey said, and the man at the scale laughed. Ellis heard it secondhand and wrote nothing about it. What he wrote that night, by the same lamp his father used, was the row count, the spacing, and one word underlined twice. Then he reached for the ledger and turned back 40 years, looking for the corner where the west field always blew bare. By June of that same year, 2013, Ellis Vange walked his first tree line on a hot, still morning and counted the dead. He had put the seedlings in clean and straight, watered them by hand from a tank on the flatbed, and then he had let the ground be. That was the mistake.
Around every little pine, the western wheatgrass and foxtail had come up thick as a lawn, waist-high in places, and it had wrapped the roots and drunk the spring rain before the trees ever tasted it. He knelt in the row and pulled the grass back from a brown cedar. The needles crumbled between his fingers, dry as old straw. The stem snapped clean. He moved to the next, and the next. Out of 100 set in that first belt, 90 were gone, choked, root and crown, by the very sod he had grown wheat on for 30 years. Ellis did not throw anything. He sat back on his heels in the hot grass and let the size of it settle. The trees had not died of cold or drought. They had died of neglect, of him thinking that ground this good would carry them the way it carried wheat. That night he wrote it plain in the ledger under the row count. 90 of 100. Cause? Grass competition. Then he added a line his father would have understood, that a seedling has no drill and no cultivator to fight for it, and that a young tree on the open plains dies of thirst, 2 feet from water it cannot reach. He ordered fabric mulch the next week. Enough, the catalog said, for 400 trees. February 2015. And Ellis Vange stood in his own lane at first light with a scoop shovel he could not use. A drift ran the length of the tractor path, waist-deep, hard-packed, and blue in the cold, exactly where he needed to drive. The second belt he had set the summer before, spaced clean and mulched right this time, had done its work. It had caught the blowing snow and dropped it. It had just dropped it in the wrong place. He walked the row and read the ground the way his father read the ledger. The trees were too close to the lane and too far from the field they were meant to feed.
Slowed wind lets go of its snow within 10 to 15 times the height of the trees, and his young belt was short, so the whole load had landed near, on the packed track instead of the open acres. He had aimed the drift like a man aiming a hose and missed the garden by 10 feet. That afternoon, Ellis drove to the Goodrich Library and asked Nora Feist, the librarian, for anything old on farm shelter belts. She came back from the back room with a cardboard box, brittle government bulletins from the Prairie States forestry work of the 1930s, spacing tables and diagrams drawn for the Dust Bowl plains. "My grandfather planted off these," Nora said, setting the box on the counter. "Nobody has asked for them in years." Ellis carried the box home and read past midnight. Every mistake he had made was already answered in those yellow pages. So why had a whole county forgotten what its own grandfathers knew?
January 2017.
And the first belt Ellis Vange had set was tall enough now to matter, chest high on the small pines. A man's reach on the cedars run together into a green wall 4 years thick. A storm had come through in the night and quit by dawn. Ellis walked out into the still cold with the ledger under his arm and a yardstick in his glove. Behind the trees, across the whole 80, the snow lay flat and even, an unbroken sheet from the tree line clear to the far fence. He pushed the yardstick down in 3 places and read it. 11 inches. 12. 11 again. A soft blanket dropped where the slowed wind let it fall. He walked west to Dale Hovland's open quarter and looked across the line. The wind had scoured that ground to bare brown stubble, the snow blown off it and heaped into a hard blue ridge along the road ditch, useless there, killing there. His father had cursed that same drift for 40 winters.
Ellis wrote the 3 numbers in the ledger and dated them. Behind him, a truck door shut. His younger brother, Wendell Vange, who farmed east of town and had said the trees were a fool's play, had driven out to see for himself. Wendell said nothing. He walked the length of the tree line once, slow, then turned and walked it again, boots crunching in the even snow, his breath white, his hand trailing along the cold needles as he went. Autumn of 2019, and Ellis Vange stood on the loading platform at the Goodrich elevator with a wheat ticket in his glove and 6 years of trees at his back. The belts were tall now, a man and a half high, dark green against the cut stubble, running long lines across ground that once grew nothing but wheat, fence to fence. He had taken maybe 6 of his 80 acres out of the crop to plant them. In 2 thin years, that 6 acres was 6 acres the bank counted against him. Dale Hovland leaned on the tailgate of his own truck and grinned across the scalehouse. "Still growing lumber, Ellis," he said. "Man could feed a county with what you fenced off in shade." Ellis folded the ticket and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not answer. He had learned that a tree line makes its own argument in its own season, and that no word he spoke on a warm October morning would move a man like Dale. Wally Simmons, the elevator manager, ran the numbers and shook his head at the light yield. Everyone on the plains had come up short that fall. Everyone blamed the dry. Ellis blamed the wind that had scoured his father's ground bare for 40 winters, and he wrote the yield in the ledger that night beside a column of snow depths going back to the year he was born. The banker in Bismarck sent a letter that same week, asking him to come in and talk about the 2 lean years. Ellis set the envelope on the shelf, unopened, and reached for his coat. The blizzard came down on a Tuesday in March 2020, and it did not quit for 3 days. Ellis Vange watched it come from the kitchen window, then pulled on 2 coats and went out to move his cattle while he still could. He walked them slow into the lee of the oldest belt, the tall cedars run together thick, and shut the gate. The wind hit the trees and went up and over. Behind the green wall the air lay quieter, the snow falling instead of flying, and the herd bunched in it and stood. Out past the fence the open country roared. He could not see Dale Hovland's quarter through the white. He could barely see his own hand. He counted his cattle by their backs in the calm strip, 31 head, and every one of them on its feet. For 3 days he carried hay into that sheltered pocket while the storm screamed 40 feet away. His father's ledger lay open on the kitchen table, 40 years of March storms in one column, and beside the old dates a word his father wrote again and again in a shaking hand. Lost. 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 Ellis had grown up believing that word was the weather itself. When the wind finally broke on the 4th morning, the radio out of Bismarck was already counting. Across the open plains, that one storm killed better than 2,000 head of cattle, most of them caught in the open with nowhere to stand. In the lee of Ellis Vange's trees, the number was none. The Saturday after the storm broke, Dale Hovland drove his truck up Ellis Vange's lane and did not laugh. He stood at the fence with his cap in his hands and looked across the 80. Behind the tall cedars, the snow lay flat and unbroken, clear to the far line, an even sheet the wind had laid down soft instead of scouring bare. Out past his own quarter, 3 miles of open ground had blown clean and then drifted the road ditches shut. Dale had buried 9 head that week, caught in the open with nothing to stand behind. He had walked his own fences, counting the ones that did not get up. "How many did you lose?" he asked. "None," Ellis said. Dale was quiet a while.
He toed the even snow and watched it hold. Then he pointed his cap west toward the flat mile where his cattle had died. "If I wanted a line like yours across that quarter," he said, "how far apart would you set them, and which way would they run?" Ellis went to the truck and came back with the ledger. He opened it to the diagram he had drawn wrong the first time and drawn right the second, the rows running square across the north wind, one belt every 20 rods so the slowed air dropped its snow before it reached the next. He turned the book so Dale could read it. The man who had called it the dumbest thing a farmer ever did stood in the cold, reading a diagram of trees, and did not say a word about wheat. What does a man think, standing on ground he mocked for 6 years? By July of 2020, the plains had turned the color of old straw. The March snow had melted off the open ground in 3 warm days and run away down the road ditches, and by June, no rain came behind it. Ellis Vange walked his sheltered 80 in the early heat with the ledger under his arm and knelt at the base of the tallest cedar belt, where the wheat ran up green and thick in the strip the trees had shaded from the wind all winter. He pulled a stalk and split the head with his thumbnail. The kernels were filling, plump and heavy. Out past the last row, on Dale Hovland's rented quarter, the wheat stood short and pale, curled at the leaf, the topsoil already blowing loose in little brown ropes across the road. The county agent, a young woman named Paige Ostrander, drove out that week to see it for herself. She walked the green strip, then the burnt one, then the green again.
"Same seed, same rain," she said. "What did you do different?" "Kept the snow where it fell," Ellis answered. He opened the ledger to the winter column and showed her the even foot he had measured behind the trees in February, the water that had gone down into the ground instead of scouring away on the wind. Paige wrote the numbers in her own notebook and did not argue. At the elevator that fall, Wally Simmons weighed Ellis Vange's wheat and read the ticket twice, a third above the light county average, while 3 miles of open ground carried barely enough to cover the seed. The winter after the harvest, in December of 2020, Ellis Vange sat at the kitchen table with his father's ledger open to the last blank page. Outside, the wind came down off the open plains the way it always had, 40 years of it in that one book, and now the cedars along the 80 took it up and over and let it go soft on the far side. He dipped the pen and wrote the season in the old column. Snow behind the belt, 1 foot even. Cattle lost, none. Wheat, a third above the county. He turned back to the front of the book, to the winter he was 12, and read again the line his father had spoken in the cold barn, and set down in a shaking hand. "You do not farm the wind," the old man had written. "You farm what it leaves behind." For 30 years, Ellis had thought it was a beaten man talking. He understood it now. The wind was never the enemy his father cursed in that column. The bare ground was. The scoured field, the killing drift, the water that blew away instead of soaking down. He closed the ledger and looked out the window at the dark rows holding the snow in place, across ground he had once been mocked for taking out of wheat. 6 years the county had called it wasted. One March had answered them. A man works the land he is given, and sometimes the wisest thing he can do with good ground is give a little of it back and let the trees keep what the wind would carry off. Ellis Vange planted where his neighbors plowed, and in the end he was the only one with a crop and a herd left standing. Would you have given up good wheat ground to grow a wall of trees, or plowed every acre like the rest of the county? Tell us in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe and stay with us, and we will be back next week with another.